The storm hit without warning, an angry sky unleashing torrents of rain that fell in sheets blurring the streets of the city like tears from heaven. Ethan Harris, the kind of man who could read the stock market better than he could read his own emotions, found himself in a rare moment of stillness as he sat behind the wheel of his sleek, midnight black Audi. The world outside seemed to match his mood, a weary, solitary man, still haunted by the shadow of his past. It had been one of those long days meetings, contracts, negotiations that never seemed to end. He had built his empire from the ground up, using grit and intellect to carve a place for himself in a world that often felt indifferent. But as the rain hammered against his windshield, Ethan couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, something far deeper than the satisfaction of a business deal or the applause of an audience that never seemed to notice his heart had been silent for years. He drove the city's lights dancing on the wet streets like fleeting stars until something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Through the torrential downpour, a figure emerged almost like a vision, a woman slumped on a park bench beneath the weak glow of a streetlight. The sight of her brought an inexplicable sense of urgency, a pull he couldn't quite explain. His first instinct was to drive past. It was late, the streets empty, and she looked like any of the homeless souls that dotted the city. It wasn't his problem. But something about her stillness, a kind of resignation in her posture, stopped him. It wasn't the restless shifting of someone trying to find comfort. It was the absolute stillness of someone who had simply given up. And in that moment, when the world seemed to hold its breath, Ethan found himself slowing the car, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He parked along the curb, the hazard lights blinking, as the engine hummed softly, almost as if giving him a moment to decide whether to stay or drive away. His mind was clouded, as though something deep inside him had awakened after a long slumber. For a brief second, he didn't think, he just acted. He grabbed the umbrella from the passenger seat, opened the door, and stepped into the cold, unforgiving rain. The downpour soaked through his tailored suit, his polished shoes splashing through the water as he approached her. The sound of his steps, muffled by the storm, was the only noise that seemed to cut through the night. She was hunched over her head, bowed, her face hidden in the shadows of her hood. He had no idea why he felt compelled to speak to her, but in the silence of the storm, he found himself calling out softly, "Ma'am." His voice barely rose above the thunder, a quiet question that felt almost like an intrusion. "Are you all right?" She looked up slowly, as though the effort of lifting her head was too much. And when their eyes met, those eyes dark and soulful, rimmed with unshed tears, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes held a depth of sorrow, a raw pain that seemed to echo his own, though he had no idea why. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice fragile and broken like glass shattering on stone. "Just leave me alone." But Ethan could see the papers clutched tightly in her hands, papers that seemed to tremble in her grip as though they were the only things tethering her to the world. A termination letter from the hospital, an eviction notice, a faint outline of custody papers barely visible beneath the rain-soaked pages. A familiar ache twisted in his chest, but he didn't know why. He had no right to feel for her, to want to know her story, but he couldn't leave her there, abandoned in the storm. He opened the umbrella and stepped closer, offering her shelter from the downpour. "You're not fine," he said gently, "and that's okay. No one should have to be fine all the time." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, as if assessing whether he was real or just another passing stranger. Then slowly she took a breath and spoke again, her voice so soft that it barely reached him. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "My job, my home, my son." Her eyes clouded over with the weight of those words, the grief that filled them, something Ethan couldn't ignore. She had been carrying the weight of the world, and it had broken her. The rain beat down harder, a symphony of sorrow that seemed to echo her pain. And Ethan, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt a deep yearning to help her. The distance between them, the unspoken divide, didn't matter anymore. She needed someone, anyone, and for reasons he couldn't quite understand, he knew he couldn't walk away. He knelt in front of her, the umbrella now shielding both of them from the storm. "I'm Ethan Harris," he said simply, his voice soft, yet steady. "And I think I understand more than you know." Her gaze flickered as if trying to process what was happening, as if she didn't deserve this kindness. She turned her face away almost as though she were ashamed of the vulnerability he had uncovered in her. Her name, when she finally spoke, it sounded like a prayer. "Lilah," she said barely above a whisper. "Lilah Carter." Ethan's heart clenched. He didn't know why, but that name Lilah Carter felt like it had been carved into the universe long before they had met. "You're not broken," he said more to himself than to her. "You've just been through things no one should have to face." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lilah's walls seemed to soften. She looked at him, the rain still falling, the darkness surrounding them, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope. As Ethan helped her to her feet, the storm that had once seemed so terrifying now felt like a harbinger of something else, something far more beautiful. He didn't know where this would lead, but in that moment he was certain of one thing. Life had a funny way of turning strangers into lifelines. If this story has touched your heart, please don't forget to like, comment, and follow us for more chapters. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share the next part of Ethan and Lilah's journey with you. The warmth of the mansion enveloped Lilah like a soft embrace as she stepped through the grand front door. She hadn't known what to expect when Ethan had offered her a place to stay, but this was like stepping into a world she'd never imagined. The polished marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air, mingling with the deep, calming scent of cedarwood. It was a far cry from the cold, sterile apartment she had once called home, now lost to foreclosure. The walls a reminder of dreams shattered long ago. Ethan led her into the sitting room, a space so elegantly furnished it seemed to shimmer in the soft light. A fireplace crackled in the corner, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had gripped her since that fateful day she had been told her son was no longer hers to care for. As she stood there, taking in the grandeur of the space, she felt the weight of her own smallness in this vast, luxurious world. "Make yourself comfortable," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm, as if assuring her she was not just a guest, but someone who truly belonged here. Lilah nodded, but the words felt foreign on her tongue. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt comfortable anywhere. The weight of the papers she had clutched in her hands earlier still pressed against her chest, though they were now safely tucked away in the bag at her feet. She didn't want to look at them, not yet, not now. But the memories they carried, the hollow ache of losing everything, settled in her chest like a constant companion. Ethan took a seat across from her, his gaze thoughtful. He had not pressed her for details, not yet. He had offered nothing but kindness and a safe space, a kindness that had slowly begun to chip away at the walls she had so carefully built around herself. But Lilah was not used to kindness, not in this way. The kindness that had once been extended to her years ago had always come with strings attached, with expectations that she could never quite meet. Her mind drifted back to the days before everything had fallen apart, the days when she had felt invincible, a young woman with a future so bright she could scarcely believe it was hers. She had been proud of her career as a nurse, proud of the way she had built a life for herself and her son. She had been proud of her marriage too, at least in the beginning, before it had slowly devolved into something toxic, something she could no longer endure. Caleb. His name still echoed in her mind like a distant, painful memory. It had been his controlling ways that had stripped her of everything: her independence, her confidence, her ability to breathe without fear. He had convinced her that she needed him, that without him she would be nothing. But the truth was, when she had finally found the courage to leave, it had been her only choice. The alternative had been to let him destroy her completely. But leaving had not been as simple as walking away. No, it had been a battle, one she had fought with everything she had. And in the end, the legal system had failed her. Caleb had money, influence, and connections, things Lilah had never had. And in the end, it wasn't enough for her to be a good mother. No, she had lost. She had lost her home, her job, and worst of all, her son. She closed her eyes, the sting of that loss still as fresh as the day the court had told her that Noah would be better off with Caleb. The judge had spoken the words with cold finality, but the weight of them had nearly crushed her. Better off with Caleb. How could they believe that Caleb, the man who had made her feel like a prisoner in her own home, Caleb, the man who had manipulated the legal system with lies and deceit, how could they hand her son over to him and expect her to let go? Tears threatened to spill, but she swallowed them down. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not now. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not when she had fought so hard to build a life for herself and Noah. Not when she was so close to losing it all. A soft rustle broke her from her reverie, and she looked up to see Ethan watching her with a quiet intensity. He had been silent for a long time, giving her the space she needed to collect herself, but now his eyes were soft, as though he could see right through her defenses. "Lilah," he said softly, his voice a gentle caress against the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need you to know that whatever happened, whatever you've been through, you're not alone anymore." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken, yet undeniable. For the first time since she had arrived, Lilah felt something stir inside her, a tentative, fragile hope. She had spent so long fighting against the world, against Caleb, against herself, that she had forgotten what it felt like to trust someone, to let someone in. And yet here was Ethan offering her a safe haven, a place to rest her weary soul. But Lilah couldn't allow herself to believe it. Not yet. Not with everything still so fragile, so uncertain. She had to remain strong for Noah, for herself. And yet she found herself wishing, just for a moment, that she could accept Ethan's kindness without the heavy burden of fear and doubt. "I don't know how to repay you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "I have nothing left to give." Ethan's gaze softened and he leaned forward slightly. "You don't need to give me anything, Lilah. You don't owe me a thing." He paused, as though choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes the greatest gift you can give is just letting someone be there for you." Her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She could feel the truth of his words, but she didn't know how to accept them. Her life had never worked like that. There had always been strings attached, always something expected in return. And now, for the first time, she was faced with the possibility of something different. A kind of love that wasn't measured by what was given, but simply by the act of being there for someone else. But she couldn't let herself go there, not yet. The world had taught her too many hard lessons, and she had learned them well. She couldn't let Ethan's kindness blind her to the reality of her situation. She had lost so much already. To risk losing herself again, no, she couldn't afford that. She stood, her legs unsteady, her breath shallow. "I should go," she said quietly, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to hold it together. "I don't want to impose any longer." Ethan stood too, his eyes locking with hers, the weight of unspoken understanding between them. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her to stay. He simply nodded, his expression soft and resolute. "If you change your mind, Lilah," he said, his voice low and steady, "you know where to find me." She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she paused, her hand on the handle. For the briefest of moments, she allowed herself to breathe in the warmth of the room, the kindness of his offer. And for just a fleeting second, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe there was still a chance for her to find something worth holding on to. The rain had not stopped, but within the grand walls of Ethan's mansion, the storm seemed far away, reduced to nothing more than an occasional rumble of thunder and the soft tap of water against the windows. Lilah stood in the vast entryway, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, as the warmth of the house surrounded her like a tender embrace. It felt like stepping into another world, one that was as far removed from her own as the stars were from the earth. Ethan had been quiet since their brief exchange by the door, allowing her to gather herself. She had not known what to expect when she had agreed to come with him. But this, the luxury, the perfection, was something she had never imagined for herself. The polished marble floors, the towering ceilings, and the soft glow of crystal chandeliers above her created an atmosphere of serenity, as though the house itself had been designed to exude calm. And yet Lilah couldn't help but feel like an intruder, an outsider in a world that did not belong to her. Ethan had led her into a sitting room that seemed plucked from a dream. The furniture was grand, but inviting, each piece a statement of wealth and taste. Yet there was a certain warmth in the room, a sense of life that spoke not just of elegance, but of comfort. A fire crackled in the hearth, its gentle glow dancing across the walls, casting soft shadows that filled the space with a quiet kind of magic. Lilah felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as she settled into one of the plush chairs, the velvet fabric cool against her skin. She had not realized how much she had been holding on to until that very moment, the constant anxiety of her life in flux, the fear of never being enough, the gnawing uncertainty about her future. It all seemed to melt away in the presence of this beautiful space, this unfamiliar kind of peace. But peace she knew was fleeting. "Would you like something to drink?" Ethan's voice interrupted her thoughts, soft yet steady, as he moved toward the grand bar in the corner of the room. His movements were fluid, graceful, and Lilah could not help but notice the way his broad shoulders filled out his jacket, the way he carried himself, with an air of quiet authority that was undeniable. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. Her mind raced with thoughts of the next step, the looming questions she had yet to answer. But Ethan, ever perceptive, seemed to understand. He didn't push her, just offered the simplest of comforts. "Water will be fine," she finally replied, her voice softer than she had intended. Ethan turned with a glass of water in hand, and as he handed it to her, their fingers brushed ever so lightly. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in Lilah's mind, sending a warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. She lowered her gaze, unsure of how to react to the unexpected rush of emotions that had flooded her in that moment. She was a woman who had learned long ago to guard her heart, to keep her emotions in check. And yet here she was, in a stranger's home, feeling as if something deep within her had begun to stir. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible as she took the glass. The cold water was refreshing, and it did little to dampen the warmth that was beginning to bloom in her chest. She sipped slowly, savoring the brief comfort it offered, while Ethan remained standing nearby, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was kindness there, yes, but also something else, something deeper, something unspoken. He took a seat across from her, leaning back slightly in the chair, his posture casual yet purposeful. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but it was not uncomfortable. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lilah didn't feel the need to fill the silence with pleasantries or forced conversation. It was as though the space between them was enough, the shared understanding of what had brought them here more than words could express. "Lilah," Ethan said quietly, his gaze thoughtful as he studied her from across the room. His voice was gentle, yet there was an underlying strength to it that pulled her attention back to him. "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to, but I want you to know that you're not alone here. Whatever you need, I'll help." Her heart twisted at his words, the sincerity in his voice like a balm to the rawness she had been carrying for so long. She could feel the walls she had spent so many years building around herself start to crack just a little in the face of his quiet empathy. But the cracks were enough to let in the light, and for the first time in a long while, Lilah felt as though she could breathe without the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on her. "I don't even know where to begin," she whispered almost to herself as she placed the glass down on the small table beside her. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Ethan or to the storm that still raged inside her. "You don't have to begin anywhere, not yet," Ethan replied, his voice soft like a promise. "Just take it one step at a time. And if that means sitting here in silence for a while, then that's enough." Lilah nodded, her eyes closing for a moment as she let the simplicity of his words wash over her. There was something profoundly soothing about the way Ethan spoke, as though he had a deep understanding of the weight that rested on her shoulders, of the battle she had fought just to get here. She had spent so long protecting herself, hiding the pain behind layers of strength and deflection. But in this moment, she allowed herself to simply exist, to take a breath, without the constant pull of worry or fear. As the night wore on, Ethan offered her a guest room large and inviting, with soft, deep-colored linens and a view of the sprawling gardens outside. The room was quiet, the kind of space that allowed her mind to settle, her body to relax. She stood by the window for a long time, watching the rain still fall in heavy sheets, the storm seemingly unrelenting. But inside there was peace, real peace for the first time in what felt like forever. Ethan had not asked her to explain the story of her life, nor did he seem to expect it. He had simply offered her a place to rest, to find solace, and perhaps to begin the long journey of healing that she knew would be harder than anything she had ever faced. But for now it was enough. And as Lilah sat on the edge of the bed staring out into the storm beyond, she allowed herself the rare luxury of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a future for her that was not defined by the past. A future where she could learn to trust again, where she could learn to accept kindness without fear, and where maybe there was a chance for something more than just survival. Tomorrow would come, and with it the challenges that lay ahead. But for tonight she would rest. And for the first time in a long while she felt a glimmer of peace in her heart. The days blurred into one another, each one a quiet extension of the next. Outside the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, the air crisp and fresh. But inside the mansion, the silence was its own kind of storm. It was a calmness that made Lilah uneasy, as if the calm before a much larger storm, a storm that was yet to break. The mansion, beautiful and vast, had become a place of refuge, but also of uncertainty. Lilah had spent much of her time in the sanctuary of her room, trying to find a sense of normalcy in a life that had been anything but. The lavish bed with its silken sheets and plush pillows had offered her a comfort she wasn't used to, and yet it felt distant, foreign to her. It was as if the more she settled into the luxury, the more she feared losing herself in it. Ethan had kept his distance, allowing her space to breathe, to think, and yet his presence was a constant, a quiet undercurrent that seemed to hum in the background of her every moment. He never pressed her to talk about the things she had locked away deep inside. He didn't demand explanations for the brokenness that clung to her like a second skin. But she could feel him watching her, his gaze sometimes gentle, sometimes intense, always present. Each morning they exchanged brief pleasantries, nothing more. He would offer her breakfast, always made fresh, always perfect, and she would accept mostly out of courtesy, though the food never seemed to reach her soul. Her heart, wrapped in layers of hurt and confusion, remained closed. She knew Ethan could sense this, but he said nothing, respecting her silence as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sun hung lazily in the sky, that their routine finally shifted. Ethan, whose presence had become a quiet force in the mansion, suggested they take a walk. "We both need some air," he said, his voice warm but not insistent. "The gardens outside are beautiful this time of year. It might do us both some good." Lilah hesitated. The idea of stepping outside, of leaving the safe confines of her room, was daunting. She had grown accustomed to the stillness of the house, the space that allowed her to remain hidden, untouched. But there was something in Ethan's tone, something tender and gentle, that pulled at her. For a moment she considered declining, but then the thought of staying inside alone with her thoughts seemed even more suffocating. She nodded, though a part of her wanted to protest, to retreat once again. Ethan didn't wait for a second invitation, leading the way through the grand hall and toward the glass doors that opened out into the garden. The air was cool, the earth fragrant with the smell of wet soil and blooming flowers. The sprawling gardens were an explosion of color, each path lined with flowers and lush greenery. Lilah felt a pang of sadness as she walked behind Ethan, the weight of her past clinging to her like an invisible cloak. It had been so long since she had experienced something as simple as the beauty of nature, as the softness of the breeze on her face. Ethan stopped at a small stone bench nestled under a weeping willow tree. The long, drooping branches created a curtain of soft green, giving them a sense of privacy. Ethan sat down first, and after a moment, Lilah followed, settling next to him, though there was still a great distance between them, an emotional chasm that neither dared cross. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves, the distant chirping of birds, and the soft, rhythmic beating of her own heart. She could feel Ethan beside her, his presence steady and reassuring, like the quiet earth beneath her feet. Finally, it was Ethan who broke the silence, his voice low and sincere. Lilah, I know you've been through a lot. I don't need to know everything, but I want you to know that I'm here whenever you're ready to talk. Whatever you need. His words were simple, but there was something in them that made her chest tighten. Something that made the walls she had so carefully constructed around her begin to tremble. She had never been good at asking for help, never allowed herself to be vulnerable to lean on anyone. But there was something about Ethan's quiet strength, his patience, that made her want to let go of all the hurt she had been holding on to. She turned to him, her gaze meeting his for the first time in what felt like days. His eyes were filled with a warmth that reached deep into her soul, something that made her heart ache with a mixture of longing and fear. He didn't look at her with pity as so many others had in the past. There was no judgment, no expectation. Just a quiet understanding, as if he could see the pieces of her brokenness and was willing to sit with her through it, to help her heal, if only she would let him. Lilah swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had no idea how to begin, no idea where to start. The words that had been trapped inside her for so long seemed to clog her throat, and yet they burned to be spoken. I don't know how to trust anymore, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to let go of the fear that holds me. I've been hurt so many times by the people who were supposed to love me. Her voice cracked, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed by the vulnerability that had slipped out before she could control it. Ethan's hand, warm and steady, rested gently on hers, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin. The touch was simple, innocent, but it sent a shiver of warmth through her entire body. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. For the first time in so long, she wanted to feel that warmth, to allow someone in, to feel something other than the cold weight of solitude that had become her constant companion. I understand, Ethan said softly, his voice low and soothing. I know it's hard, but you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. His words were like balm on an open wound, soothing in their tenderness, yet they brought with them an unfamiliar ache. She had spent so long building walls around herself, protecting herself from pain, that the thought of letting someone else in felt like an impossible feat. But with Ethan's hand still resting gently on hers, a small seed of hope began to take root inside her heart. I'm not asking you to forget, Ethan continued, his voice steady and reassuring. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm just offering you a place to be, to heal, to breathe. You don't have to be strong all the time, Lilah. It's okay to lean on someone. It's okay to let yourself be cared for. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She didn't know if she could do it, didn't know if she was ready to be open, to be vulnerable. But as she looked into Ethan's eyes, so warm, so sincere, she found herself wanting to try. For the first time in a long while, Lilah felt the stirrings of something deep inside her, something that had been buried beneath layers of pain and fear. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something softer, something more fragile, a willingness to trust, to let go of the fear that had controlled her for so long. Ethan's hand stayed on hers, and the warmth of it seeped into her very bones. He didn't push, didn't rush her. He simply sat with her in the quiet, in the stillness, offering her a piece of peace she had forgotten how to seek. And for that moment at least, Lilah allowed herself to lean into it, to feel the tenderness that lay beneath the surface of everything. She didn't know what the future held, but with Ethan by her side for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could begin to hope again. The days that followed the walk through the garden were both gentle and weighty, as though the universe was allowing time to stretch out, giving Lilah space to breathe, while simultaneously pushing her toward an inevitable reckoning. The mansion, once so foreign and intimidating, had become her refuge, a sanctuary of sorts, where she could exist without the constant weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Still, it was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of something unspoken between her and Ethan, a tension that seemed to hum softly in the background of every interaction, every glance exchanged. It was as if the walls around them, built by both time and circumstance, were beginning to crumble bit by bit. Ethan never pushed her to speak, never demanded more than she was willing to offer. His patience was like the calm of the ocean before a storm, steady and unyielding. He had a way of being present without being intrusive, of offering kindness without expectation. But Lilah could feel the weight of his silence, the way his eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, the way his hands brushed hers whenever their paths crossed in the hallways or in the quiet of the kitchen. There was something in the way he looked at her, something tender, something that reached into her chest and tugged at the remnants of a heart she thought had been irrevocably broken. One evening, as the first stars began to pierce the velvet sky, Ethan invited her to join him for dinner in the dining room. The table was set, beautifully candles flickering in their holders, casting a soft, warm glow over the room. The aroma of fresh rosemary and garlic filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wine that had been carefully selected for the occasion. "Dinner's ready?" Ethan said, his voice carrying a hint of quiet amusement as he placed the final dish on the table. His gaze met hers across the room, and for a brief moment there was something in his eyes, a look so intimate, so full of promise, that Lilah's breath hitched, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Thank you," she replied softly, though the words felt somehow inadequate, as they always did when she found herself in his presence. Grateful yet hesitant, she moved toward the table, feeling as though the very air between them had thickened, charged with a current neither of them could name. They ate in silence, the clinking of silverware against fine china, the only sound that filled the room. Lilah found herself acutely aware of every little detail, the way the wine glistened in the glass, the delicate fabric of the napkin that lay on her lap, the way Ethan's hand moved as he poured more wine into their glasses. She could feel the proximity between them, could sense the unspoken words hovering just beyond the surface, waiting for the right moment to slip out, to break free. She wasn't sure when it started, the way her thoughts would wander to him when she least expected it, the way his absence would leave a quiet ache in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had made her feel seen, truly seen, in the way that Ethan did. It was as if he could reach inside her, past the wall she had built, and understand the depths of her pain without needing an explanation. That kind of understanding was both terrifying and comforting, and Lilah didn't know how to reconcile the two feelings within her heart. When they had finished eating, Ethan poured them each another glass of wine. The conversation was still light, casual, nothing too deep. They spoke about the weather, about books, about the small, inconsequential things that filled the quiet spaces between them. But beneath the surface, Lilah could feel the tension building, could sense the slow, inevitable pull that seemed to draw them closer, even as she tried to resist it. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "But if you want to talk about it, about anything, you can." Lilah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many words that were waiting on the tip of her tongue. But how could she put it into words? How could she explain the weight of the fear she carried, the shame, the anger? How could she explain the longing for a life she had once known, and the loss of everything she had fought for? Instead of speaking, she stood and moved toward the large window that overlooked the garden, her hands gripping the edge of the sill as she stared out into the night. The air was cool against her skin, a gentle reminder that the storm had passed, that there was still beauty in the world beyond the confines of her own pain. But it was hard to see that beauty when her heart felt so heavy, when the shadows of the past loomed over her, like a storm cloud that would never dissipate. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Ethan's voice was softer now, closer, though she hadn't heard him move. She didn't turn around, but she could feel him there, standing just behind her, close enough that his presence filled the space between them. "I've lost everything," Lilah whispered, her voice barely audible, as though saying the words out loud would somehow make them too real to bear. My home, my career, my son. Her chest tightened with the admission, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. The loss, the grief, the emptiness that had consumed her ever since that moment in the courtroom, when she had been forced to let go of the one thing that had once defined her motherhood. Lilah! Ethan's voice was thick with emotion, a softness she hadn't expected. He reached out his hand, resting lightly on her shoulder, and though it was a simple gesture, it carried with it the weight of something more, something unspoken. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time in a long while, Lilah didn't feel so alone. She turned to face him, then her eyes meeting his. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a quiet sorrow that mirrored her own, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice rough with emotion. No one should have to go through what you've been through. Lilah shook her head, her throat tight. I don't deserve your sympathy, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm broken. Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time he stepped closer to her, the space between them now completely closed. His hand, still resting on her shoulder, gently cupped her cheek, and the touch sent a shiver through her. She could feel the warmth of his palm, the strength in his fingers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to lean into it. You're not broken, Lilah, he said quietly. You've been through hell and you're still here. That's not broken. That's strength. The words felt like a balm on the rawness of her soul, and without thinking, she reached up her hand, covering his, holding it against her skin. For the first time, she didn't pull away. She didn't shield herself from the tenderness he offered. Instead, she let herself feel it. Let herself feel something other than the emptiness that had been her constant companion. I don't know how to trust again, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to let myself believe that I'm worthy of something good. Ethan's thumb gently stroked her cheek, the motion tender and slow as if he had all the time in the world. You don't have to trust everything at once, he said, his voice soft and steady. Just take it one step at a time. Let yourself heal, Lilah. It's okay to let go. The words hung between them, a fragile thread that seemed to bind them together. And as Ethan's hand lingered on her cheek as her eyes met his, with an intensity she couldn't deny, Lilah knew that for the first time in so long, she was beginning to believe. She was beginning to believe in the possibility of healing, in the promise of something more. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the quiet tenderness of the man who stood before her, offering her something she had never known she could have a second chance. The sun had not yet risen when Lilah woke her mind, already a flurry of memories, each one a jagged piece of her past that she had tried so hard to forget. The dreams had come again, as they always did in the quiet hours before dawn, bringing with them the echoes of a life she had once known, and a love that had turned to ashes. She sat on the edge of the bed, the cool sheets still warm from the night before, and pressed her hands to her temples, willing the thoughts to stop. But they didn't. They never did. The past had a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how much she tried to bury it. She hadn't spoken much to Ethan about her life before the mansion, before the storm that had torn everything apart. She had told him bits and pieces, just enough to explain why she had come to this place, but never the full story. Never the part that still haunted her in the quietest moments of the night. Her mind drifted to Caleb. Even saying his name in her head felt like an assault. When she had met him all those years ago, he had been the man of her dreams, the protector, the one who promised to love her with all his heart. He had been charming, confident, and seemingly perfect. They had built a life together, a small house in the suburbs, a steady job, and a little boy, Noah, who had filled their world with joy. At first it had seemed like everything she had ever wanted, but love, as it turned out, was not enough to sustain them. Caleb's charm had quickly turned to control, his affection to manipulation. At first it had been small things, little comments about her appearance, her choices, her friends. Then came the isolation. He had made her believe that she didn't need anyone else, that his love should be enough. And for a long time it had been. She had given everything to him, every piece of herself, until one day she realized that she had nothing left to give. He had taken it all. The bruises on her soul were not as visible as the ones that had marred her skin, but they had been there buried beneath the surface, festering like an infection. It was his words that hurt the most, though each one a barb that had pierced her heart until it had become numb to the pain. He had made her feel small, insignificant, like she wasn't worth the air she breathed. And when she had finally found the strength to leave, to break free from the chains he had wrapped around her, it had felt like stepping into the unknown. But she had not been prepared for the fallout, the court battles, the lies, the manipulation. Lilah swallowed hard, pushing the memories away, but they were stubborn and they refused to stay buried. Every detail was seared into her mind, the way Caleb had looked at her when he had finally realized she was no longer under his thumb. His eyes, cold and calculating, had made her stomach churn. It had been his final act of control, taking Noah from her, turning her own son against her. The judge had ruled in his favor, citing her lack of stability, her financial troubles, her inability to provide a secure home. In that moment, as she had stood before the courtroom watching Caleb walk away with Noah in his arms, she had felt as though she had lost everything. The world she had fought so hard to build had crumbled in an instant, leaving her with nothing but empty space where her family had once been. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. She needed to focus. She needed to stop thinking about Caleb, about everything that had happened before she had found herself here in this strange new life with Ethan. She stood and walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtains aside just enough to let in a sliver of light. The sky was pale blue, the sun still low in the horizon, casting a soft glow over the manicured gardens below. It was peaceful here too, peaceful almost for someone like her who had lived her life in constant chaos. The peace was suffocating. The world outside seemed so far removed from the darkness she carried with her. But here in this mansion surrounded by luxury and comfort, she was forced to confront the things she had tried to forget. The weight of her past felt heavier with every passing day. Ethan's kindness, though welcome, was a reminder of everything she had lost. She could feel it, his care, his patience, and yet she didn't know how to accept it, didn't know how to believe that someone like him could ever see her as more than the broken woman she had become. As much as she wanted to believe in the possibility of something new, of a future with Ethan, with Noah, she was afraid. Afraid of being vulnerable. Afraid of trusting someone with her heart again, only to have it shattered once more. And yet she could feel the shift in the air when Ethan was near. It was subtle, the way he made her feel safe, the way his presence steadied her. There was something in his eyes, something kind and unguarded, that made her want to believe again. But then the memories would return, the echoes of Caleb's voice, the sting of his rejection, the cold weight of his absence in her life. She had tried so hard to forget him, to move past the wounds he had inflicted, but they were still there, buried deep inside her. She could feel them every time she looked at Ethan, every time his eyes softened, every time he extended a hand that she wasn't sure she could take. The door creaked open behind her and she turned, startled. Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression gentle, his eyes searching her face. There was no judgment there, no expectation, just a quiet concern, a tenderness that made her heart ache in ways she didn't know how to express. "You're up early," he said softly, stepping into the room. "Everything okay?" Lilah nodded quickly, turning back to the window. "I'm fine, just thinking." Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and then he moved toward the bed, sitting down on the edge with a quiet grace. Thinking about what? Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to find the words. She wanted to tell him everything, the pain, the loss, the demons that still haunted her every step. But she couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to expose the rawness of it all. She had spent so long burying it, pretending that it didn't exist, that she didn't know how to begin. Instead, she shook her head and gave a soft, hollow laugh. "I don't know how to explain it." Ethan didn't push her. Instead, he simply sat there, his presence like a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. His silence was a gift, and though it was hard for Lilah to accept, she was grateful for it. "I'm here if you need me," he said, his voice low and steady. "Whenever you're ready." And for the first time in a long time, Lilah believed him. She believed that Ethan wasn't just offering her words, he was offering her something real, something she had never known before. But the demons of her past still lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike when she least expected it. And for now, all she could do was breathe, to take things one moment at a time, and hope that someday she could find the courage to face them, and maybe, just maybe, let go of the past that still held her in its grip. The days that followed Ethan's quiet assurances felt like a fragile moment suspended in time, a calm before the storm. Lilah had grown accustomed to the steady rhythm of her life in the mansion, the peaceful routine of breakfast with Ethan and Lucas, the shared moments of silence in the garden, the conversations about books and dreams. It was a life she hadn't dared to imagine for herself yet. It was one that she now clung to with a quiet desperation. In the sanctuary of the mansion, she could almost forget the fight that still awaited her, almost forget the looming battle over her son. But the reality had begun to creep in. The envelope had arrived on a Friday, the heavy weight of it a physical manifestation of the burden she had been avoiding. The legal documents had sat on the small table by the door for hours, unacknowledged, until the weight of them finally drew her in. The letters on the front had been too familiar, too cold, too official. Caleb's attorney. She had thought she was prepared for this moment. She had thought the months of anticipation had steeled her against the harsh sting of the legal world, the world that had taken everything from her piece by piece until she was left with nothing but her heart and a quiet determination to fight for the one thing she could still claim: her son. But when she opened the envelope, the documents inside crushed her spirit all over again. A motion for full custody. The words blurred in front of her eyes, the weight of the legal jargon a blur against the background of her memories. Caleb was relentless. He had managed to twist every detail of her life into something ugly, something unfit. He had manipulated the court system before, and now he would do it again. The motion outlined everything he would argue: her financial instability, her past mistakes, her current dependence on Ethan. It was a calculated, well-dressed attack that made her feel small, vulnerable, and powerless. The thought of facing Caleb again, of sitting across from him in a courtroom, brought back the crushing fear she had tried so hard to bury. She could still feel the weight of his words from the last time they had stood together in front of a judge, the coldness in his eyes when he had taken Noah from her. But now she was no longer the woman who had walked away from that courtroom defeated. She had fought to rebuild herself, and though it had been difficult, she had done it. She had found a place of peace, however fragile it might be, and a love that made her believe in something other than survival. Lilah Ethan's voice was soft but full of concern, breaking her from the fog of her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his figure framed by the soft light of the hallway behind him. "I thought I heard you. Everything okay?" She hadn't even realized she had begun to cry. The tears had slipped down her cheeks unnoticed, the weight of the reality she was facing too much to bear. She tried to compose herself, wiping at her eyes, but the dam had already broken. The walls she had built around her heart, carefully constructed over the years, were crumbling beneath the pressure of everything she had been carrying. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, the words a confession, a plea. "I don't know if I can fight him again. I don't know if I have the strength." Ethan stepped closer, his presence a steady, unwavering force in the chaos of her emotions. He didn't ask what had happened. He could see it in her face, could see the fear that had once again settled into her bones. Instead, he sat beside her, his hand gently resting on hers, offering the silent comfort she needed. "You don't have to do it alone," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with something deeper, something more than just kindness. There was something in his words that made her want to believe in the impossible, in the strength she wasn't sure she had. "I'll be here with you, every step of the way." The offer of his support, so simple yet so powerful, made something shift inside her. The fear that had clung to her like a second skin began to loosen just a little. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but for the first time she didn't feel so alone. Ethan's presence beside her was a balm to her wounded heart. He wasn't asking her to be strong for him to mask her fears. He was simply offering her a shoulder to lean on, a safe place to exist in her rawness. Lilah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to simply breathe without the weight of the world pressing down on her. The room was still, the silence between them, comforting, and for a brief moment she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could face Caleb again. She could fight for Noah, for the future they had once dreamed of. "I need to go over these documents," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a quiet determination in it now. She wasn't ready to face Caleb yet, but she would be. She would fight with everything she had. "I need to know exactly what I'm up against." Ethan nodded, his hand still holding hers, his thumb gently brushing across her knuckles in a soothing rhythm. "I'll be here when you're ready. Take your time." And so she began to read the words on the paper, starting to make sense despite the coldness of them. She had spent years perfecting the art of survival, of pushing through, of keeping her head down and her heart guarded. But as she read through the motion, a quiet fire began to spark in her chest. She wouldn't let Caleb take Noah from her again. She wouldn't let him win. The next few days were a blur. The documents, the meetings with her lawyer, the research on the best course of action, it all seemed to happen in a haze of paperwork and decisions. But through it all, Ethan was there. He never questioned her choices, never told her what to do. He simply offered her a steady hand to hold, a voice of reason when her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. One afternoon, after another long meeting with her lawyer, Lilah found herself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching Ethan and Lucas. The two of them were seated on the floor playing some game with building blocks, Lucas's laughter ringing through the room, pure and untainted. Ethan was laughing too, his voice light and easy, as he encouraged Lucas to build taller and taller towers. Lilah couldn't help but smile at the sight. She had spent so long trying to protect herself from everything, the world, the pain, the fear, that she had forgotten what it was like to truly connect with someone. Ethan and Lucas's bond was so natural, so effortless, and for a moment Lilah allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have that kind of peace, that kind of safety again. She wasn't sure how the battle would unfold or if she would ever regain full custody of Noah. But in that moment, watching the two of them together, she realized something important. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Lucas, for the kind of love and stability that he deserved. And she was fighting for Noah, for the chance to build a future for him, one where he would never have to feel the weight of his parents' brokenness, one where he could grow up free from the shadow of Caleb's control. The legal battle had only just begun, and there were no guarantees. But with Ethan by her side, with his quiet strength and unwavering support, Lilah felt for the first time that she could face the fight ahead. No matter what happened, she would not back down. She would not let the ghosts of her past define her future. And so, with the documents laid out before her, with Ethan's steady hand in hers, Lilah made her decision. She would fight. She would fight for her son, for herself, and for the life she knew she deserved. The weeks following Lilah's decision to fight Caleb felt like an endless stretch of waiting. The legal proceedings moved slowly, their pace a constant reminder that time was not on her side. Every letter that arrived, every court date, every meeting with her lawyer added another layer of pressure, another stone to the weight she had been carrying. The constant hum of anxiety in her chest became her constant companion, its grip tightening every time she allowed herself to imagine what might happen if the court ruled against her. But there were moments, quiet moments, when the world outside the walls of the mansion faded away. In those moments, she found solace in Ethan's presence, in the way he always seemed to know when she needed a touch, a word, or even just the silence of his company. She began to lean on him in ways she hadn't thought possible, letting him take some of the burden she had carried alone for so long. Ethan never pushed her to talk about it, never forced her to share the details of her fight, but she could feel him beside her, his presence steady and unyielding, a constant source of strength. His kindness, his gentle understanding were like a balm to her soul, soothing the rawness of her fears and doubts, even if only for a moment. One evening, as the last light of day slipped away behind the horizon, Lilah sat in the living room, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her wineglass. The house was quiet save for the soft rustling of leaves outside and the occasional creak of the wooden floors beneath her feet. Ethan was in the study working on something for his company, though Lilah knew that the silence between them wasn't born of distance. They had simply settled into a comfortable rhythm, one where words weren't always necessary to communicate the depth of their connection. But tonight the tension in the air felt different. Lilah had been avoiding the topic of Caleb had been pushing down her fears, but the inevitability of the battle that loomed ahead had finally caught up with her. She had been fighting the urge to talk about it, to bring it all out into the open, but tonight she couldn't hold it in any longer. She set the glass down gently on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she stood and walked toward the study. Ethan was hunched over the desk, his attention absorbed by the documents in front of him, but he looked up as she entered, his eyes softening when they met hers. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, sensing the shift in her energy, the way the space between them had suddenly grown heavy with something unspoken. Lilah opened her mouth then closed it again, unsure of how to begin. She had become so accustomed to holding her emotions in check, to bottling up the fear, the uncertainty, the guilt that it felt foreign to speak them aloud. But Ethan's steady gaze, his quiet concern, made her feel as if she didn't have to hide anymore. "I can't do this anymore," she finally said, her voice a whisper in the quiet room. She sank into the chair across from him, her eyes finding his, searching for the comfort she had come to rely on. "I can't keep pretending that everything is going to be okay. Caleb, he's relentless. He'll stop at nothing to take Noah from me. I can't lose him again, Ethan." Ethan's expression softened, his features tightening with a mix of concern and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite place. He stood and moved toward her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders as he crouched in front of her, meeting her gaze head on. "You won't lose him," he said firmly, his voice low but full of conviction. "You're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere. We'll do this together, whatever it takes." His words were comforting, grounding even, but the fear in Lilah's chest refused to be soothed. Caleb's shadow loomed over everything she did, every decision she made. She couldn't escape it, couldn't escape him. He had always known how to manipulate her, how to twist her weaknesses into weapons, and she could already feel him doing it again. "I don't know if I can keep fighting," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of the admission. "I don't know if I have the strength anymore. What if I fail? What if I lose him for good?" Ethan's hands tightened on her shoulders, his grip gentle but unwavering. "Lilah," he said, his voice soft but insistent, "you're not failing. You've already fought for everything you have. And I'm here. I'll be here every step of the way. We'll find a way to win this." The warmth of his words was undeniable, but the pit of doubt in Lilah's stomach refused to be filled. She didn't want to drag Ethan into her fight, didn't want him to be pulled into the same storm that had ravaged her life for so long. But it was impossible to ignore the way his presence had become a lifeline for her, the way his strength seemed to fill the spaces she had once thought were beyond repair. And yet she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she was losing control, that the battle for Noah's custody was slipping further and further from her grasp. Caleb had always been the more powerful force in their relationship. His wealth, his influence, his ruthlessness were things Lilah had never been able to compete with. "I wish I could believe you," she said softly, her voice full of sorrow. "I wish I could believe that everything will be okay, but Caleb has a way of winning. He always does." Ethan's eyes narrowed with determination, the subtle shift in his expression, a sign that he was no longer willing to accept the weight of her doubts. He took her hands in his touch warm and firm, grounding her in the present moment. "You've already won, Lilah," he said, his voice low and full of certainty. "You've already proven that you're stronger than he ever gave you credit for. You've come this far. Don't let him take that from you now." Lilah looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She had come so far, but the road ahead seemed impossibly long. The battle was only just beginning, and she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Caleb would fight dirty, just as he always had, and the court would only be a battleground for his manipulations. And yet, with Ethan's hands holding hers with his words of reassurance in her ears, she began to believe. Just a little. For the first time in a long time, the fear that had controlled her every decision seemed to loosen its grip just enough to let her take a breath. I don't know what will happen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm not giving up. Not this time. Ethan smiled softly, his expression filled with quiet pride. I never doubted you for a second. The tension that had been building inside her began to ease just slightly, but it was enough to give her the strength she needed to stand tall. The road ahead would be hard, and Caleb's demons were far from over, but Lilah knew one thing for certain: she would no longer fight alone. Ethan was with her, and with him by her side, she felt a small, fragile hope stir in her chest. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Lilah felt as though the odds might just be in her favor. The trial loomed, its shadow growing longer with each passing day. Lilah spent her nights studying legal documents, her mornings meeting with her lawyer, and the rest of her time with Ethan and Lucas. She had become a master at compartmentalizing, shutting away the overwhelming emotions that threatened to drown her whenever she allowed herself to feel. But the truth, as it always did, found its way into the cracks of her defenses. The battle for Noah's custody was unlike anything she had ever faced before. Caleb had a way of turning every moment into a game of manipulation, and he had a team of lawyers who were skilled in the art of turning a mother's love into something questionable, something dangerous. Every step forward in this fight felt like it might be the last, and the fear of losing Noah, of losing her son for good, gnawed at her constantly. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when the breakthrough came, as though the universe had conspired to grant her one fleeting moment of clarity, a moment of grace amid the turmoil. The trial had been dragging on for weeks. Caleb's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Miranda Walsh, had been relentless in her pursuit of portraying Lilah as unstable, as a woman who had failed to protect her family and her son. Each day felt like a new assault on her character, each accusation another arrow aimed straight at her heart. But Lilah hadn't backed down. She had stood tall, her heart heavy, with the knowledge that her son was watching, that this battle was not just for her, but for him. Ethan had been by her side through it all, his quiet strength a constant reassurance. But even he could not quell the rising tide of doubt that crested within her whenever she stepped into the courtroom. She had begun to doubt herself, to question whether she was strong enough to win. The fear of losing Noah was a ghost that haunted her every waking hour, its presence a constant ache in her chest. This particular morning, however, as she sat in the courthouse hallway, waiting for the proceedings to begin, she felt something shift. The air around her was thick with tension. Each lawyer, each witness, each look exchanged was another thread in the tangled web of emotions and strategy that defined this legal battlefield. She felt a sharp pang of anxiety in her chest as her lawyer, Rebecca Chen, briefed her on what would happen next. "You've done everything right, Lilah," Rebecca said, her voice steady, but her gaze heavy with the weight of the case. "But this next step is crucial. We need to show the court that Caleb's accusations about your stability are just that, accusations. We need to prove that you are a fit mother, that you have the strength to give Noah what he needs." Lilah nodded, though she could feel the doubt creeping back in. She didn't know if she had the strength. She didn't know if she could keep fighting in the face of Caleb's lies, his manipulations, his twisted version of the truth. But then, just as the tension was about to swallow her whole, she felt Ethan's presence beside her, a calm, grounding force in the midst of the storm. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood by her, his shoulder close enough that she could feel the warmth of him radiating through her. And then he spoke, his voice low and steady, just for her. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Lilah," he said. "You've already proven everything that matters. You love Noah. You've always loved him. And nothing anyone says in that courtroom can take that away." Lilah looked up at him, meeting his eyes with a quiet intensity, as if searching for the truth in his words. His gaze was unwavering, filled with something more than just affection. There was a deep, unspoken understanding between them. Ethan had been her rock through all of this, But now in this moment, his words felt like a shield, a barrier between her and the storm that raged just beyond the walls of the courtroom. I'm scared, she whispered, the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long, suddenly spilling out. I'm scared that I'll lose him. I'm scared that I'm not enough. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch firm and reassuring, his fingers wrapping around hers in a gesture that spoke louder than words ever could. You are more than enough, Lilah. You're already everything Noah needs. For a moment, the world outside faded into the background, and in that small, quiet space, it was just the two of them. The doubts that had clouded her mind, doubts about her strength, her ability to fight, seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Ethan's belief in her, his unwavering faith, was enough to quiet the storm inside her. She had always fought alone, always relied on her own strength to get through. But in this moment, she realized something that had eluded her for so long. She didn't have to fight alone anymore. The sound of the doors to the courtroom opening broke the spell, and Lilah's heart skipped a beat as she rose to her feet. The familiar fear crept back into her chest, but it was tempered now, softened by Ethan's words, by his steady presence beside her. As they entered the courtroom, the room seemed to close in around them. Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, his eyes cold and calculating as always. Lilah could feel his gaze on her, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in weeks, she felt something stir within her, a quiet strength and unspoken resolve. When it was her turn to take the stand, Lilah stood, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear. She spoke the truth about the love she had for her son, about the pain of losing him, and about the strength it had taken to rebuild her life. Every word was a declaration, a promise, not just to the court, but to herself. I have made mistakes, she said, her voice steady, but I will never stop fighting for my son. I will never stop being the mother he deserves. Her words hung in the air, a quiet defiance that resonated deep within her. She could feel Caleb's eyes on her, feel the weight of his disdain, but it didn't matter. She had said what needed to be said, and for the first time she didn't care about his reaction. When her testimony ended and Rebecca had finished her closing arguments, there was a moment of silence that stretched on longer than Lilah had anticipated. She felt the weight of every eye in the room on her, but in that silence, she finally understood something crucial. It wasn't just the facts that mattered. It was the love she carried for her son, the unshakable belief that she was his mother, that she could give him the life he deserved. As the judge deliberated, Lilah stood by Ethan, his hand wrapped around hers, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she allowed herself to believe. She believed in herself. She believed in the love she had for Noah. And perhaps for the first time, she believed that love might just be enough to win this fight. The breakthrough moment wasn't the words she had spoken in the courtroom, but the realization that she had found her own strength, not in the past, not in the court's verdict, but in the quiet moments she had spent learning to trust, to love, and to believe in herself. And when the judge finally returned the decision hanging in the balance, Lilah felt a quiet peace settle in her chest. She had done everything she could, and that she knew was enough. The courthouse stood tall against the gray morning sky, its towering stone columns casting long shadows on the sidewalk below. Lilah could feel the weight of it, not just in the structure of the building, but in the way it loomed over her. The very air around the courthouse seemed to press in, as if it understood the stakes of the day, as if it too were holding its breath for what would come next. She stood at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The air outside was crisp, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled her. It was the storm that raged within her, the clash of fear and hope that battled for dominance in her chest. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a steadying force that kept her grounded in the chaos. He hadn't let go of her hand since they left the mansion that morning, and his grip was firm, reassuring. It was the kind of support that had become a lifeline for her over the past few weeks. But today she needed more than just his steady presence. She needed to find the courage to face Caleb once and for all, and to prove that she was the mother Noah needed. As they walked toward the front steps, Lilah couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. She had come so far, had fought so hard to rebuild her life, and yet she knew that the outcome of today's hearing would determine everything. She would either walk out of that courtroom with Noah or not at all. The doors to the courthouse opened, and they stepped inside, the air cooler and more formal than outside. The clack of their shoes against the polished marble floors echoed in the empty hallway, and Lilah felt the weight of it all: the legal professionals, the onlookers, the cold calculating judgment of a system that would decide her future and her son's. Ethan squeezed her hand again, his voice soft. "We're in this together, no matter what happens." Lilah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to believe in the strength of the bond they had built, but the fear of what might happen, what Caleb might do, made her doubt herself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. The walls were lined with dark wood, the room bathed in a cold, formal light. Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Beside him was Miranda Walsh, his attorney, a sharp, calculating woman whose every move seemed designed to intimidate. Lilah couldn't help but feel the weight of their eyes on her as she entered, their gaze heavy with judgment. She didn't look at Caleb. She couldn't. His presence was a constant reminder of everything she had lost, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply he affected her. But she could feel him, the coldness of his gaze, the way his very being seemed to radiate a kind of control. He had always known how to manipulate her, how to twist her insecurities into weapons, and even now she could feel him trying to do the same. Lilah and Ethan took their seats at the defense table, her lawyer Rebecca Chen already prepared for the battle ahead. Rebecca gave her a brief, encouraging smile, but Lilah could see the worry in her eyes too. This case wasn't just about facts, it was about the perception of her as a mother, the image that Caleb's team would try to paint. The judge, a woman in her 60s with stern features and an air of authority, called the proceedings to order. Her voice was firm as she asked the attorneys to present their cases. Caleb's lawyer stood first, walking to the center of the courtroom with the measured confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. Lilah knew what was coming: the onslaught of accusations, the painting of her as unfit, as unstable. Miranda Walsh began with a calculated tone, her words carefully chosen, each one an arrow aimed directly at Lilah's heart. "Your Honor, the evidence before you is clear. Ms. Carter's life has been unstable, marked by financial struggles, a broken marriage, and a recent move to a new home. She is at best an unreliable parent." Lilah's pulse quickened as the words struck her like a blow. It wasn't the first time she had heard them, but hearing them in this context, in this sterile room, made them feel like a judgment, one that would haunt her if she let it. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, weighing her, measuring her worth as a mother. It was all she could do to keep her hands from shaking. Miranda continued, her voice smooth and steady like a well-oiled machine. "Furthermore, Ms. Carter's relationship with her current partner, Mr. Harris, is concerning. She has shown a lack of stability in her personal life, and it is clear that her emotional state is compromised. A woman in such circumstances is simply not capable of providing a stable home for a child." Lilah's heart dropped as Miranda's words twisted the truth. She knew the insinuations were false, but in a courtroom, perception was everything. She had never been one to play games to pretend that everything was perfect, but the life she had built for Noah with Ethan was real. It was more real than anything Caleb could offer, and yet here she was, fighting to prove it. Ethan's hand was still on hers, a quiet strength, but Lilah could feel the tension in his body as he sat beside her. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He was holding it together for her, just as he always did, but she knew how much this was weighing on him, how deeply he felt the unfairness of it all. When it was her turn to speak, Lilah stood slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head, but standing there in front of the judge, the jury, and Caleb's piercing gaze, it all seemed so much more real, so much more difficult than she had imagined. She took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, I understand the concerns that have been raised about my life. I am not perfect, and I have made mistakes. But there is one thing I know for certain: I am Noah's mother. I have fought for him since the day he was born. I have given him every part of myself, and I will continue to do so for the rest of my life." Her voice trembled, but she didn't let herself falter. "I have been through hardships, financial struggles, a failed marriage, but I have rebuilt my life. I have built a home for my son, a home filled with love, with safety, with stability, and I will fight for him. No matter what it takes, I will fight for him." Her words hung in the air, the silence in the courtroom palpable. Lilah stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest, but she felt something shift within her. She had said the words she needed to say, had spoken the truth that had been buried deep inside her for so long. The judge's gaze softened, just a fraction, and for a brief moment Lilah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this battle wouldn't end in defeat. When the proceedings broke for lunch, Ethan stood beside her, his eyes filled with quiet pride. He didn't need to say anything. His presence, his unwavering belief in her, was enough. "We're one step closer, Lilah," he whispered, his hand resting lightly on her back. "You've done the right thing. You've shown them who you really are." Lilah nodded, but deep inside a storm still raged. The battle was far from over, and Caleb had not yet shown his hand. But as she walked out of the courtroom, her heart was a little lighter, her steps a little firmer. For the first time, she felt like she had truly taken control of her own story. And for the first time, she knew she wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse as the hearing adjourned for a brief recess. Lilah sat in the same seat she had occupied for the last several days, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. She could still feel the sting of Caleb's lawyer's words echoing in her chest, the weight of the accusations threatening to crush her. And yet beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else, something she hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. Hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. When she had spoken in the courtroom, when she had looked the judge in the eye and told the truth of her love for Noah, something inside her had shifted. She had given all of herself, the parts she had kept hidden, the parts that were raw and vulnerable. And now, despite the looming dread that still clung to her, there was a small flame of belief that maybe, just maybe this time, the outcome would be different. Ethan sat beside her, his presence a quiet strength. He hadn't said much in the last few moments, but Lilah could feel the calm energy he radiated, the sense of quiet determination that he always carried with him. He was there for her not just as a partner, but as someone who understood her in a way no one else did. "Do you think it went well?" she asked, her voice softer than she meant it to be. Ethan turned to her, his expression thoughtful but steady. "You were incredible, Lilah," he said. "You told the truth, and you told it with courage. That's all we can do." She nodded, though her mind was still spinning. The courtroom had been a battleground, and she had fought with everything she had, but the final judgment was still a mystery. Caleb had not yet made his move, and she could sense that he was waiting for something, waiting for a moment when she might falter, when the cracks in her armor would show. As they stood to stretch their legs during the recess, Lilah's thoughts drifted to Noah. Her heart ached with the absence of him. The memories of the time they had spent together, of the nights she had tucked him into bed, of the way his laughter had filled their small apartment, seemed like a distant dream. She had fought to be his mother, to give him everything she could, and now the thought of losing him for good seemed like a cruel twist of fate. But just as the weight of that thought began to settle in her chest, she heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to see her lawyer, Rebecca, striding toward them, with a look of urgency in her eyes. Lilah's stomach clenched as she met Rebecca's gaze. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice tight. Rebecca's expression was serious, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "There's been a development," she said, her voice low but sharp. "A piece of evidence, new evidence, has surfaced, and it's something we weren't expecting." Lilah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't known what to expect next, but the feeling that had settled in her stomach now was anything but reassuring. "What kind of evidence?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. Rebecca paused for a moment, her eyes flicking briefly to Ethan, who stood silently beside Lilah, a frown forming on his face. "It's an affidavit," she said carefully, "from someone who claims to have witnessed an altercation between you and Caleb. Someone who says they've seen something that changes everything." Lilah blinked, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of information. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "What exactly does this witness say?" Rebecca's lips tightened again, and she glanced toward the courtroom as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. "The witness claims that Caleb was physically violent toward you during the time you were living together before you left him." The words hit Lilah like a thunderclap. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. The room seemed to spin around her, her pulse pounding in her ears. Caleb had been violent toward her. She had known that, of course. The bruises, the emotional scars, those had been the consequences of his control. But to have someone else come forward to have that violence so explicitly brought into the light felt like both a blessing and a curse. She had never spoken about the violence directly, not in public, not in court. It was a piece of herself she had hidden away, buried deep within the walls of her soul. The fear, the shame it had, all stayed locked up, as if admitting it to anyone else would make it real. And yet here it was, threatening to undo everything she had tried to rebuild. "This could change everything," Rebecca continued, her voice urgent. "If we can corroborate the affidavit, if we can prove that Caleb's behavior was not just emotional, but physical, that he was abusive, it will shift the focus of this case entirely. It will show the court that you were not just the victim of a broken marriage, but of real tangible harm. It will show them that Noah deserves to be with you." Lilah felt her breath hitch in her throat, the gravity of Rebecca's words crashing over her in waves. She had spent so long bearing the truth, keeping the worst parts of her marriage hidden away, that the thought of it coming out of it, becoming public, of Caleb's abuse being put on display for everyone to see, filled her with a dizzying mix of terror and relief. "But how can we trust it?" Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, low and steady. His gaze was fixed on Rebecca, his brow furrowed. "How do we know this witness is telling the truth? How do we know this isn't just another attempt to manipulate the court?" Rebecca paused, her expression serious as she met Ethan's gaze. "We don't know yet," she admitted. "But we'll find out. The witness is willing to testify under oath. And we're going to track down the details, get a statement, verify the timeline. But for now, we have a potential breakthrough." Lilah stood in stunned silence, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She wanted to believe it, to trust that this could be the turning point they so desperately needed, but fear held her back. Fear that Caleb would twist this into something else, something worse. Fear that it might be too late. "Where is the witness?" Lilah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's lips parted, but before she could speak, a figure appeared at the courtroom door. A man dressed in a simple suit, his face familiar, but his features unclear. The moment Lilah saw him, something inside her clenched. It was a man from her past. A man who had been a neighbor, someone who had seen the cracks in her marriage before she had left Caleb. He wasn't just a witness. He was someone who had seen the bruises, had seen the brokenness, had known the truth. Lilah's heart pounded in her chest as the man stepped into the room, his eyes flicking to her in recognition. There was no going back now. The truth was about to be laid bare, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ethan's hand tightened around hers, his gaze steady and unwavering. "We're with you," he said softly, "no matter what." The unexpected twist had arrived, and Lilah had no choice but to face it. Whatever Caleb had planned, whatever he had hoped to control the truth, had its own power now. And for the first time, Lilah was ready to let it shine. The courtroom was a silent chamber, its heavy air pressing down on Lilah as she stood at the defense table, her fingers curled tightly around the edge. The hum of voices had quieted to a tense hush, the judge's gavel echoing like a distant drum beat in the recesses of her mind. She could feel the weight of the moment, the air thick with the gravity of everything that had led her here. The culmination of weeks of legal battles, of arguments and accusations, of digging into the darkest corners of her life. And now, after everything, the silence seemed to stretch on interminably. The judge had deliberated long enough. The verdict was close. She could almost hear her own heartbeat in the stillness, each thud of her pulse a reminder of the stakes. Caleb sat across from her, his posture rigid, his gaze cold, his expression a careful mask of indifference. It was the same look he had worn throughout the trial, the same look that had haunted her during their years together. His eyes, unblinking and calculating, seemed to mock her. Mock the vulnerability she had finally shown in court, the truth she had laid bare. Lilah felt a small wave of nausea rise in her chest as she met his gaze. There was something about him that still held power over her, despite everything. She had never been able to escape the way his presence had always filled the room, the way his influence had seemed to stretch out like a shadow following her, controlling her. But today she was different. Today she had fought, and she had fought with everything she had. For Noah, for herself, for the life she had built in the aftermath of so much destruction. The judge's voice cut through the air, breaking the oppressive silence. "We have reached a decision," she said, her voice firm and unyielding, as though she had been waiting for this moment as long as everyone else in the room. She turned to Caleb, then to Lilah, her gaze sweeping over them both with a neutrality that was almost cruel in its finality. "I have reviewed all of the evidence presented, including the new testimony and the affidavit from the witness," the judge continued. "Based on the testimony provided and the facts at hand, I am ruling in favor of the defendant, Ms. Lilah Carter." The words hit Lilah like a shockwave, a rush of adrenaline surging through her veins as the courtroom seemed to blur around her. For a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as though time had stretched and suspended itself in that single moment of recognition. She had won. It was a victory she had dreamed of, a victory she had fought for with every ounce of strength she had. She had won the right to be Noah's mother again, the right to raise him in a home filled with love, to be the mother he had always deserved. She wanted to smile to feel relief, but there was something else, a tightening in her chest, a lump in her throat that refused to dissolve. Behind her she felt Ethan's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady, grounding her. He had been there for her through every moment of this battle, and now as they stood on the precipice of this victory, she knew it was his unwavering belief in her that had carried her this far. His presence was a constant reminder that no matter what, she wasn't alone. The judge's voice brought her back to the present. "As a result of this ruling, I am granting full custody of Noah to Ms. Carter," she said, her gaze moving between Lilah and Caleb. "Caleb Harris will have visitation rights as per the established agreement, but the primary residence of the child will be with Ms. Carter." Lilah's head spun the room, seeming to tilt around her. She could hear the murmurs of the court, the rustle of papers, but all of it felt distant, like it was happening in another world. All she could think about was Noah, her son, the boy she had almost lost forever, the boy who had once been the center of her world and now finally would be back in her arms where he belonged. Her eyes sought out Ethan's, and for a brief moment, everything around them faded away. The look in his eyes said it all: pride, relief, and something softer, something more intimate that made Lilah's heart ache with a kind of fullness she hadn't known she could feel. But as the room filled with the sound of shifting papers and the shuffle of footsteps, Lilah could feel the crushing weight of the victory beginning to settle into something else, something more complex. Her gaze flicked to Caleb, who remained seated, his expression unreadable. His face had tightened with anger, his jaw clenched, but he hadn't moved. He hadn't reacted in the way she expected. And for a moment, Lilah wondered if he was even capable of the kind of rage she had braced herself for. But then she saw it. The subtle shift in his eyes, the flicker of something darker behind the mask of his calm. It was almost imperceptible, but she saw it, and it struck her with a sudden, terrifying clarity. Caleb wasn't finished yet. As the courtroom began to empty, Lilah stood still, her legs shaky beneath her, trying to absorb the shock of the moment. Ethan's hand remained on her shoulder, steady and constant. The rush of emotion was too much relief, too much fear, too much uncertainty. And yet, despite the victory, despite the fact that she had won the right to raise her son again, There was something deep in her gut that told her this wasn't the end. Caleb would never accept defeat. Lilah turned her heart pounding as she caught Caleb's gaze one last time. He was standing now, his back straight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't look defeated. He didn't look like a man who had just lost everything. No, he looked as though this battle was far from over. For the first time in this entire fight, Lilah allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She felt a sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the war was not yet over. Caleb had not surrendered. When Caleb's lawyer Miranda came forward to discuss the specifics of the visitation rights with Rebecca, Lilah found herself alone with Ethan for just a moment. The noise of the court around them seemed to fade, leaving them standing in the eye of the storm. Ethan stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, and Lilah let him take it, needing the comfort of his touch more than she had ever needed anything. He looked down at her, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a soft line. "You've done it," he said softly. "You've won, Lilah." But the words, though comforting, felt distant. The victory, while sweet, tasted bittersweet on her tongue. Caleb had lost the battle, but she knew him well enough to understand that he wasn't finished. The quiet rage that simmered in his eyes had made that clear. "I've won," she repeated, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm not sure the fight is over." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," he said. "Not now. Not ever." Lilah turned her face up to him, the tears she had held back threatening to fall. She had won Noah's custody, but there was still a long road ahead, a road filled with uncertainty, filled with Caleb's dark intentions. And yet in that moment, with Ethan by her side, Lilah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace, in the possibility of healing, victory and heartbreak. Two sides of the same coin, she realized. But for the first time in a long while, the hope that had once been so fragile now felt like something she could hold on to. And with Ethan beside her, with Noah's future waiting for them both, she finally understood that maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever came next, together. The months following the court's decision passed in a haze, a blur of moments both joyful and tinged with the quiet aftermath of the battle Lilah had fought. Noah was home. He was home. And every day she woke up to the sound of his laughter, the sight of him running through the house with Ethan's son Lucas as they played together, their shared joy filling the corners of their world with light. The house that had once felt too large, too empty, now felt like a home again, a real home, a place where love and laughter flowed freely, where every room was filled with the echo of life of family. For the first time in a long time, Lilah could breathe without the crushing weight of fear in her chest. She could look out the window and see the world without the shadow of Caleb hanging over her. And yet there were moments, quiet moments, when she would catch herself staring out of the window, her heart heavy with the memories of the fight. The scars of the past, though healed on the surface, remained etched deep within her. There were still days when she felt the sting of what she had lost the years with Noah, the life that had been stolen from her by someone who had never truly loved her. But those days were becoming fewer now. Slowly she had learned to let go of the past, to let it fade into the distance, like the storm that had once threatened to swallow her whole. She had rebuilt her life piece by piece, and though the foundation was still fragile, it was stronger than it had ever been before. The mornings were simple now. The kitchen was always alive with activity, the sounds of breakfast being made, the chatter of Lucas and Noah, their voices overlapping in the way only children's voices could. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and for a brief moment, Lilah could almost forget the chaos that had once defined her life. For a brief moment, she could allow herself to believe that this simple, beautiful life was all she would ever need. Ethan stood beside her in the kitchen one morning, his tall frame leaning casually against the counter as he watched her move around the room. There was a softness in his eyes, a quiet pride that made Lilah's heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. He was still the steady presence in her life, the anchor that held her grounded when the world seemed too large, too unpredictable. But in the months since the hearing, something had shifted between them. It wasn't the kind of shift that came with grand declarations or gestures. No, it was subtler than that, like the quiet growth of something new, something unspoken but deeply understood. She caught his gaze for a moment and a soft smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. What she asked, her voice light but curious. Ethan's smile was slow, but there was something in it, something warm, something that spoke volumes without needing to be said. I just, I look at you, Lilah, and I can't believe how far you've come, how strong you are. You've rebuilt everything. Lilah turned back to the stove, stirring the eggs with a slow, deliberate motion. She didn't know how to respond. The words felt inadequate, strong, rebuilt. Those were words she had used for herself, words she had whispered into the silence of the night when she needed to remind herself that she could survive, that she could overcome. But hearing them from Ethan, hearing them spoken so simply with such certainty, made something shift inside her. "You've been here with me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't have done this without you." Ethan stepped forward, closing the small gap between them, his hand reaching for hers. His touch was warm, a comfort she had come to rely on more than she had ever imagined. His fingers brushed against hers, a tender, familiar touch that sent a rush of warmth through her chest. "You've done all the hard work, Lilah," he said softly. "I'm just lucky to be here with you, lucky to be part of this." Lilah looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat at the sincerity in his eyes. In the quiet of the kitchen, amidst the hum of morning routines and the noise of two children racing through the hallway, she felt something settle deep within her, a peace, a completeness that she hadn't thought possible. And in that moment, as she stood there with Ethan, surrounded by the life they had built together, Lilah realized something important. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She wasn't just fighting for the next day or the next breath. She was living. She was living, and for the first time she had everything she needed. Noah's voice broke through the moment, the sound of his laughter, a reminder that life was moving forward. He and Lucas appeared in the doorway, their faces flushed with the excitement of a new game they had invented, their energy infectious and bright. "Mama," Lucas said, "I can be the captain of the ship today." Noah shouted, his excitement bubbling over. His smile, wide and full of life, was enough to light up the entire room. Lilah couldn't help but laugh, her heart swelling, as she watched her son, her little boy, full of life and joy. She knelt down to him, her hands resting on his shoulders, as she looked into his wide, trusting eyes. "Captain, huh?" she said with a smile. "What's the ship's name?" Noah thought for a moment, tapping his chin. "The Sea Dragon," he declared, his eyes gleaming with pride. "It's the biggest ship in the whole world." Lilah's heart ached in the best way possible as she pulled him into a tight hug. The world felt perfect in that moment, perfect and whole, as if everything had come together exactly as it was meant to. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching the two of them, his arms crossed, his expression soft but proud. It was the kind of moment he had always imagined, the kind of life he had dreamed of when he thought about the future. And now it was theirs. It was real. "I'm proud of you," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with warmth. "I'm proud of both of you." Lilah's heart fluttered at his words. She didn't need grand gestures or fancy promises. She didn't need anything but this quiet, everyday life that she had fought so hard to build. And in this moment, as she watched her son play with Lucas, as she stood next to the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word, she realized that what she had was enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur of laughter and simple joys. The children played together, their imaginations running wild, while Ethan and Lilah worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing dinner and sharing quiet conversations. There were no lawyers, no courtrooms, no accusations. There was just the life they had fought for, just the love they had found, amidst the rubble of everything that had once been. As evening fell and the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Lilah stood on the porch, her hand resting lightly on the railing. The air was cool now, the sky a deep indigo dotted with the first stars of the evening. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a constant comfort, and Noah and Lucas's laughter still rang out from the backyard. their carefree joy a testament to everything they had built together. Lilah closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. She had been through so much pain, so much fear. But now here with Ethan by her side, with Noah laughing in the distance, she felt a peace she had never known before. They had rebuilt their lives one day at a time, and now for the first time in years, Lilah could finally say that she was home. The morning sunlight spilled through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. The house was still save for the gentle hum of the coffee machine and the faint rustle of the leaves outside as a breeze stirred the branches. Lilah stood at the kitchen counter, the warmth of the sun on her skin, as she poured herself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in delicate spirals. It was a quiet moment, one of the many she had come to cherish in the months since Noah had come home. This home, it was more than just the physical space they inhabited. It was a reflection of everything she had fought for, a life rebuilt from the ashes, a new beginning, a place of peace where love could flourish. The sound of Noah's laughter echoed from the other room as he and Lucas played together, their voices full of joy, innocent and free. Lilah felt a warmth in her chest as she took in the sight, the sound, the sensation of having her son with her once more. It had taken everything to get to this point, the battle, the heartache, the fear, but now standing in this moment with her family gathered around her, it was all worth it. Ethan entered the kitchen, his smile effortless, his presence still as steady as ever. He had become a part of her world in ways she had never imagined, and the quiet, unspoken bond between them was something she had come to rely on, something that grounded her amidst the uncertainty of life. "Morning," he said softly, his voice still carrying the remnants of sleep, but his gaze was warm and full of affection. He moved to the counter, reaching for the sugar, his fingers brushing against hers as he did. It was a small gesture, but it was enough a reminder of the connection they had built, the quiet, tender affection that had blossomed between them. "Good morning," Lilah replied, her smile softening as she met his gaze. She had come to rely on these small moments, these simple exchanges that spoke volumes without needing to be said. There was no rush, no hurry in the mornings now. Just the time to sit, to be with each other, to savor the life they had created. She handed him the coffee cup, and as he took it from her, their fingers lingered, a brief, almost imperceptible moment of connection that felt like everything. They didn't need words to communicate anymore. Not when the bond between them was so strong, so rooted in trust, in shared experiences, in the quiet knowledge that they were in this together. The fight for Noah, the aftermath of the court battle, the uncertainty of what had come before they had weathered it all. And now with the future before them, they were finally ready to move forward. "How's Noah this morning?" Ethan asked as he took a sip of his coffee, his eyes lifting to where the children's voices carried through the walls. Lilah's heart swelled as she thought of her son, his laughter still echoing in the background, filling the house with life. "He's happy," she said softly, her voice full of affection. "I think he's finally starting to feel settled. It's like he knows he's home now." Ethan's eyes softened at her words, and he set his coffee cup down, crossing the kitchen to where she stood. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close in a gentle, intimate embrace. She melted into the warmth of him, the safety of his arms around her, offering a comfort she hadn't known she needed until now. "I'm proud of you," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "You've fought so hard, Lilah. You've given everything for Noah, and now you get to enjoy the life you've built." Tears welled in Lilah's eyes at his words, though she fought them back, the overwhelming wave of gratitude and love, too much to contain. It had been a long, painful road to this moment, but with Ethan by her side, she had found the strength to face it, the strength to rise above the doubts, the fear, and the heartbreak. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without your belief in me. You've been my rock, Ethan. You've helped me rebuild everything." Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands resting gently on her shoulders as he looked down at her, his expression soft, yet filled with a quiet intensity. "We've rebuilt it together," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that made her heart flutter. You, me, and Noah, we're a family, and nothing is going to change that. Lilah smiled, her heart full, as she leaned in to kiss him gently, the simple act of affection, a testament to the bond they had formed. It wasn't just the love between them that had brought them here. It was the shared understanding, the willingness to support each other, to be there when the world seemed to fall apart. As they pulled away, the sounds of Noah and Lucas's voices became louder, signaling the end of their quiet moment. But neither of them minded. There was no rush anymore. No need to escape into the world outside. For the first time, Lilah felt as though everything she needed was right here. She turned toward the living room, her heart still light as she watched Noah and Lucas playing together. She could see the bond that had begun to form between them, the kind of connection she had always dreamed of for her son, the kind of connection she had never thought possible with Caleb in the picture. Noah's eyes sparkled with joy as he handed Lucas a toy, his small voice filled with excitement. "Look, Lucas, the dragon can fly." Lilah's heart ached with pride as she watched him. The boy who had been torn from her arms, the boy she had fought so hard to bring home, was now here, safe, happy, and surrounded by love. "Come on," Ethan said softly, his hand finding hers again, as he gently led her toward the living room. "Let's join them." Together they walked into the living room, the laughter of the children filling the air. For a moment it was just them, Lilah, Ethan, Noah, and Lucas, surrounded by the warmth of the life they had created together. The house, once a place of uncertainty and fear, had become their sanctuary, their home. The future stretched before them, wide open with possibilities. There were still challenges ahead. There would always be challenges, Lilah knew that. But for the first time in so long, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Not with fear or doubt, but with the quiet confidence that she was no longer alone. Ethan sat down beside her on the couch, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the children play. And in that moment, Lilah allowed herself to believe in the future they were building together. The past had shaped her, yes, but it would not define her. She was ready for this new beginning, for this life, for the family they had created. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the room, Lilah realized that this simple, beautiful moment was everything she had ever needed. It was her new beginning, and it was perfect. You said begin writing the final part, building forever, with a length of approximately fictional in characters in a romantic storytelling style. Use graceful, refined, and emotionally persuasive language to captivate the audience. Include a call to action. ChatGPT said part 15, building forever. The seasons had changed as they always did, but this year they felt different. The world around them was no longer just a backdrop to Lilah's struggles. It was part of the new life she had built one piece at a time. The house, the family, the moments with Ethan and Noah, all of it was hers now. The life she had once thought impossible, too broken to ever be fully mended, had become her reality. She stood in the garden one crisp autumn evening, the last of the sun's rays lingering on the horizon. The sky was painted with shades of gold and pink, the air fragrant with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. It was a moment of stillness, of peace, and for the first time, Lilah allowed herself to drink it in fully, without the weight of fear or the shadow of the past looming over her. The sound of footsteps approached, and before she could turn, she felt a familiar hand on her shoulder. Ethan's presence had become a comfort she didn't know she needed, a constant companion through the everyday joys and struggles. He had become more than just a man she loved. He was her partner, her equal, the one who had stood beside her when the world seemed too much to bear. "I was wondering where you'd gone," he said softly, his voice warm and steady as he stood beside her, looking out at the garden with her. Lilah smiled, turning her face toward him. His hand slipped into hers, the contact gentle, familiar grounding. "Just needed a moment," she replied, her voice full of quiet contentment. "It's hard to believe how far we've come." Ethan nodded, his gaze flickering between her and the setting sun. He had always been steady, always been a rock, but the softness in his eyes when he looked at her now was something new, something she had never imagined she could have. It was as though he saw her not just as the woman who had fought so hard to rebuild her life, but as the woman who had allowed herself to heal to love again. "It's more than we could have dreamed of," Ethan said, his thumb brushing over her hand in a slow rhythmic motion. "But it's ours now. We've earned it." Lilah looked at him, the words echoing in her heart. We've earned it. It wasn't just the house or the peace or the life they had built together. It was the love they had found, the quiet understanding between them, the way they had grown into each other's lives, weaving their hearts together one thread at a time. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her body melting into his, the warmth of him surrounding her. "We have, haven't we?" A soft silence fell between them, a quiet understanding that needed no words. Their life was not perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, of fear that flickered in the corners of their minds. Caleb's shadow would always be a part of their story, no matter how far removed it became. But in this moment, standing together in the fading light of day, Lilah realized that what they had built was stronger than anything she had ever known. Noah's laughter floated from the porch where he and Lucas were playing with their dog, the joy in his voice pure and unhindered by the complexities of life. It was a sound that filled Lilah's heart, reminding her of everything she had fought for, everything they had fought for. "Do you ever wonder what the future holds?" Lilah asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper, as though speaking the question out loud made it feel real. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with the certainty that only came from years of knowing each other. "I don't need to wonder, Lilah. I know we're building it together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it. Together." Tears stung at the back of her eyes, but they were different now. These tears weren't of sorrow, of fear, or of loss. They were tears of relief, of gratitude. Her heart had been through so much, had borne so much weight, but in this moment she realized how far she had come, how far they had come. She had found her way back to herself, to the love she had once thought was impossible. "I used to think I'd never get to this place," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly with the weight of the words. "I thought I was too broken, too far gone to ever have a future like this." Ethan turned his head toward her, his gaze unwavering as he cupped her cheek in his hand, tilting her face gently upward. "You're not broken, Lilah," he said, his voice full of tenderness. "You've always been strong. You just needed to let yourself see it. And now we have everything we need." She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing his words to wash over her. She had never been able to fully see the strength within herself, had never known just how much she was capable of. But with Ethan, with Noah, she had learned to trust in herself again. She had learned that love wasn't something to be afraid of, but something to be built, nurtured, and cherished. A gentle breeze swept through the garden, rustling the leaves of the trees, and Lilah lifted her gaze to the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear, their soft light piercing the darkening sky. "I'm ready for the future," she said, her voice a quiet vow, "for whatever comes next." Ethan squeezed her hand, his expression filled with quiet determination. "So am I," he said, his voice steady and filled with promise. "And I know that no matter what happens, we're going to build it together." And in that moment, Lilah knew that the future was not something to be feared. It wasn't something to be left to chance. It was something to be built day by day with patience, love, and understanding. Together they would face whatever came their way, knowing that they had already weathered the hardest storms. The light of the stars above them seemed to shine brighter now, as if reflecting the light they had built together in the darkness. And for the first time in a long time, Lilah felt a deep, abiding peace settle in her heart. They had built there forever, and nothing, no one could ever take that from them.